Sorry, sorry if you listen to the lectures and like it immediately starts out with great and it's like really loud. You're like, oh snap.
When you listen to the lectures on 2 times speed and you do the ooh, it's like really fast. It's like
Oh, that is exciting. Thank you. Okay, great. So we're going to learn about something called ajax and a function called fetch, right? So not this ajax, something else, right? Does anyone like know what that is? Or are you guys all like a Dawn family? Okay, very good. Nice. You like Dawn because they save the ducks, the oil. I remember the whole thing. Cool. So here are like some important objectives to kind of get through today, and that is we have to understand what the difference between something called synchronous code and asynchronous code. All right, we're going to recognize code that uses promises. Promises are very complicated. So I didn't want the verbiage to say understand promises because that would be a lie. I just need you to be able to recognize what a promise is, right? And essentially how to kind of manipulate it a little bit. Using the .then method and then using ultimately the fetch method, right? So what does synchronous and asynchronous mean? Just even in English, or you can kind of like, take a look at this real quick. Just tell me what you think synchronous or asynchronous means. So sync or async. That's what I'm going to start saying because I'm lazy.
One at a time.
Yes. JavaScript is synchronous, right? It means that it will execute top to bottom, left to right, one line at a time. We talked about this a little bit in like the first 2 days of JavaScript. And so does Ruby. So how do we do asynchronous code? And what is that exactly? Well, if you remember in Mod 2, in your Rails server, who remembers like debugging your Rails server, right? Jumping into maybe like the Rails console or something, going back to localhost 3000/awesome, and then being like, oh, I forgot to start the server. You go to your terminal, then you're like, great, Rails S, and you immediately try to go to localhost again, and then it takes a little bit to spin up, and then that GET request takes a little bit to process, right? Who remembers this? They are not instantaneous, right? Any sort of GET request, post, put, patch, any request to a server will take time. How much time is in the air, right? Sometimes it's super fast. Sometimes you're waiting on the Rails server, and it's just kind of tricky. So what we want to do is we want to understand how to do asynchronous things with a synchronous programming language. Before we even get to JavaScript, let's go back to this amazing, sweet, syntactical sugar of Ruby, right? Ruby, sync, cool. So, do you guys like Ruby? Some of you have told me that Ruby's bomb. It's pretty bomb. Cool. So all this is doing is it's pulling in these three gems, right? REST client, JSON, and pry. So what is JSON? Have you guys been introduced to this yet? Cool. So what is it? Very good. Exactly, right? It's JavaScript object notation. So the idea here is that as I'm making these web requests, I should be able to make these web requests and get data back that does not matter the programming language that you're using. So for example, if I'm writing Ruby and I'm a Rubyist and I'm a elitist and I think I'm just better than you, I should be able to make this web API, get data back, and then do something with it. Does that sound like a fair world where like someone who programs in Python, someone who programs in JavaScript cannot do the same? Like if Yelp, for example, Yelp has an API. You can imagine it has just a list of restaurants, locations, names. If I were to hit this API, do I want to exclude any type of developer? No. What I would like is, I would like all of my data in this language agnostic data set, right? And that's just what JSON is. It's language agnostic. It comes back, it looks like a hash or an object or a dictionary, whatever you want to call it. It's just key value pairs. And then your language has to take that data and then convert it into something that that language knows. Does that make sense? So if I'm getting this JSON data back, I need to parse it into something JavaScript knows. Or if I'm writing Ruby, I need to get this JSON data back and then parse it into something Ruby knows. Does that make sense? Cool. So, yeah,
Does JavaScript have to parse it, meaning that it is JavaScript optimization?
JavaScript will have to parse it.
Yeah. Why is it called that?
That's actually a long story, and I'll tell you offline. I'll tell you offline. This is a long story. All right, cool. That's a good question, though. All right, so all this is doing, right? Boop, 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 boop. Sorry. It's going to take a quick nap. It's going to be right back. It's going to run a function called sleep. Right? And what sleep does is just waits 5 seconds, and it'll literally just hang out. And then it will say, cool, I'm waking up now. And then it's going to make an HTTP GET request with REST client. And so here I'm just going to save the data in something called a Ron Swanson quote. And I'm going to run something called REST client.get. You can imagine then that what other types of requests can I make besides GET? Post, put, patch, and delete, right? REST client knows it's doing a GET request because I specified GET right here. And all it's going to do is it's going to go to this particular URL, and then it's going to save that data into a variable. I'm going to say request is complete, and then I'm going to do some stuff to it. Cool? Let me drop this binding real quick, and then let's see what happens when I run it. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, that didn't work out. Where's my terminal? Embarrassing. Cool. All right, so how do I run a Ruby file? Ruby, and then the file name, right? I think it's like sync.rb. Cool. So I should see exactly that, and that is great. I am taking a nap. Be right back. 2, 3, 4, 5, and then bam, the code runs. Right? There was that pause in my code, and now I'm in the binding. So far, so good. I should be able to check to see what is the result of that GET client request, that REST client request, right? So if I take a look at it, I see something called REST client response. If I check the class, because it's important to always understand the data type you're working with, what should I see? A REST client response, which makes sense because the REST client, right, this class used a class method to get back a response and naturally just returned data in that class. You can kind of see a little bit here about like what it's about to say, but not really. So what I really need to do again is I need to be able to take this response and I need to parse the JSON. So here all I'm going to do is run json.parse on this REST client object. Does that make sense so far? Cool. And then I see in an array, creativity is for people with glasses who like to lie. Sorry if you wear glasses. I didn't say this. I think it's hilarious. Either way, so does everyone understand like what just happened, right? I got some language agnostic data back, and then I needed to parse it so that I can actually have access to it. If I go ahead and check the class, it is in fact an array, something that Ruby is familiar with and acknowledges and knows. And then I can do something like this, right? Because it's an array, I can just take the first index of it and just get that object back. So far, so good? Great. Cool, let's exit out of here. Now, then it just finished, right? And then it just printed the parse quote. Are there any questions as to like how Ruby runs and then what this did? All right, let's see how JavaScript likes to kind of handle these things. Boop, boop, boop. Great. JavaScript, however, doesn't have an internal sleep function, so I had to like create one. Don't worry about all this bad math. Just know that it's gonna wait like a random amount of time, probably like 10 seconds, something like that, and then it's gonna like execute some code. Cool. So what I can do is I can log, cool, starting, and then I can boop, 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 run sleep. Right? How do I invoke this function? Can I just run it like this? Stop playing, right? Cool. I don't know what number goes in here. What's a good number? 10, cool. Right? And then I'm going to log, all right, woke up, right? Stay woke, cool. Right? Any questions on what this does? Right. So all I'm gonna do is go back here, open up the console so I can kind of see it. Don't worry about that. If I hit refresh, what should I see? Right, I'm starting the sleep function, and then shortly thereafter, I should see starting, and then boom, 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 some random amount of time, whatever that sleep function runs, then stay woke happen. Cool? Are there any questions as to like what just happened? Right, should be pretty straightforward at this point, right? So, when this happens, right, let's crank that sleep up a little bit, all right? And so when I refresh, right, I need to clear this. When I refresh, right, I actually have a click, no, dang it. We should add a click handler to that, right? Let's do that. Boop, boop, boop. Sorry. Great. Let's take a look. In my HTML, I have this click button. All I'm going to do is grab this click button, add an event listener so that it console logs when I click it. I'm just going to kind of walk through that pretty quickly. And that is simply over here. I'm going to do document.get query selector. Sorry. Old habits die hard. And what is the ID here? Boop, boop. Boop. And how do I do this? Like a dot? Does this work? Cool. So smart, right? And that is what? This is just the const button. And then on the button, I'm going to add an event. Dang. The first time you do it, it doesn't like autofill. It's such a pain. Cool. And what do I want? What's the event? Smart. And then what do I put in here? A what? Let's put a callback, right? And that's just going to literally console log, right? Click to me, smiley face. Cool. Oh snap! Hold on. Dang it! Embarrassing. Cool. What a terrible user experience, right? The sleep function seems to be blocking me from doing anything. When I click now, I'll have this click, right? So what I want to see here is on refresh, while that sleep function is running, I want you to listen and observe to see what happens in terms of the functionality of the click button. So I hit this refresh, and I hit click, click, click. And then finally, all of that happened, right? Is that a good user experience? Should all of my JavaScript actions pause while another function is running? No, like we've seen yesterday on Twitter, right? Even on like Airbnb, as things load, can I still scroll? Can I still click on something else while these things are loading? Yes, right? Like you've done it, right? Like something's loading in the background and you're like, oh, that's whack. Let me just go do this in the meantime while it loads, and you're doing something else on the side. Right? That is like the better user experience. So what's happening here is I need to outsource these web requests, right? If I'm getting additional data from a server, which we've just discussed can take a random amount of time, I still want the functionality of my website to either scroll, click a button, submit a form. Something should still be happening. The user should still be able to interact with my website. So I need to make the web requests happen in the background. So far, so good? And so if something is happening in the background, sort of parallel, almost concurrently, right, at the same time, it is known as asynchronous. I mean, it's happening not synchronously. It's not happening at the same time. Sorry, not happening one at a time. It's happening sort of parallel at the same time on like two different things. Two different processes are happening at the same time. Does that make sense? So Chrome will process one, and then your code, your JavaScript, will be processed in another sort of engine, so to speak. Does that make sense? So far, right? Like basically this web request and your JavaScript code runs at the same time. So it's asynchronous, meaning my JavaScript code is not waiting for my request to come back before the next line of JavaScript is running. So far, so good? Great. So in order to create that amazing user experience, what we want to do is we want to have these things happen in the background. So, does everyone have a better like feel for like async? It's happening almost like concurrently, asynchronously in the background. Where if we remember what synchronous is, it's one at a time. It's not one at a time anymore. It's going to be all the logs and then the sleep function. I want that sort of like web request to happen in the background at the same time my JavaScript is running and loading.
Where is the JavaScript loading from? Isn't it?
From the server. Yeah.
So what's the other thing that's being requested to the server?
The web request, like another GET request for more tweets. Yeah? Okay, cool. So, correct. Now, let's do this. These are just examples of something that's like asynchronous. All right, let's get to it. So, in order to make an asynchronous web request, there's a command called fetch. It works very much like REST client. And fetch will just need a URL. So, I'll just drop this in here. Look up. Look up. If you're curious as to like what this returns, we can always go to the browser, make our own GET request to that URL, and we should see something, right? If I make a GET request, oh wow, that didn't work. That was weird. Oh, because I put it in string. Wow, Google's good. Cool. Great. And there it is. Like that's the data that I was like looking for, right? Don't worry about what's in here. Just it's about like being able to get the data. That make sense? So if I run this fetch, right? I pass in the URL. What do you think this will return? What did REST client.get return? It returned a REST client object. Remember? So if I were to run this fetch to this particular URL, what I get back is a promise. I get back this promise object. Cool? So, they didn't get the event loop video. I'll explain it. All right. What I get back is this promise object, right? And so, how do I let fetch know, and I'll touch base on promises, that this is a GET request? How did I know that this was some sort of GET request? Who has any thoughts? It's like a tricky question, right? Exactly, right? I didn't tell it, right? You don't see GET anywhere in here. So naturally, you could probably assume that this is sort of like this default functionality. And you can imagine that GET requests are the most common type of web request, right? Would you say you do more gets than you do posts, right? Like when you log in, how many times you log in versus you just look at another person's profile or like something, or I don't know, what else people do? Like read a newspaper, click on another article, like troll Reddit. There's so many more GET requests, so naturally it's the default. If I wanted to pass in another argument and tell it specifically what method to do, I would put it inside the actual fetch request as a second argument, and I would pass it in as a method and simply get. Cool? Who has an idea of how to change this to maybe like a post request? Right, I would just change this to post, right? Cool, so far so good. So I'm gonna leave this in here. And it's just like, so you can see it. However, it will run without it, without this method get, because get is the default. Is everyone clear on that? Great. If it returns a promise, right, I need to wait until this fetch request is done. This promise you can think about as, hey, I'm gonna send off this web request, and I promise you, when I have gotten the data, then I will give it to you. Does that make sense? When I send this fetch request off to this URL, any URL, As we've talked about, it takes a little bit of time, an unknown amount of time, and then I'm going to come back and give you the data. Once I've gotten it, then I will give it to you. So far, so good? Once I've gotten the data, at that point, that's when I will give it to you. And then I will give it to you. Once I've gotten it, then I will give it to you. So far, so good? There is a particular special method that you can run on promise objects. So what does fetch return? A promise, right? So what I can do is right at the end of this, right? Some of you have done this in Ruby and probably got frowned upon. Method chaining, where you like attach a bunch of methods on it. Great. I'm simply going to call then on this fetch request. And all this method does is when the promise comes back with data, then it will do something. So far, so good. So here, JavaScript's an amazing language where space is sort of almost agnostic. So instead of like attaching it right to the end of the fetch, I'm going to just do this. It's essentially the same. The then is being attached to the fetch. So far, so good? No, this is, you don't have to, like this will work, but I'm using an indentation because I can then separate the additional method call, and then I can see my code more clearly. And that's a very good question. Thanks for asking. All right, so in the same way that REST client returned what type of object? A REST client object, right? So this probably returns some type of object that I cannot immediately use in JavaScript, right? When you run then, right, you want JavaScript to do something, right? How do you tell JavaScript to do something? You need a function. So then probably takes what type of function? Callback function, right? So function, boop, boop, boop. So far, so good? Great. In the then, right, I'm probably going to receive this data, right? The promised data. Does that make sense? Like in the callback, what I'm going to do is do something. And I need to do something with the data that came back. So we can simply log, before we do anything else, what is the promised data? Will this run right now? Who says it will run? Who says it will not run? Okay. Let me ask you this. Is fetch being invoked? So will it run? There we go, right? No, I'm just saying, like, you know, good job. So if I were to go back, actually, let me get rid of the sleep. Yeah, it's gone. We don't need this either. Trash. Boop, 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 boop. Boop. Oh, almost in JavaScript hell. Cool. So the fetch will run, right? And then something will happen. I'm going to get back this promised data, and then I'm just going to console log it. So if I refresh, I'm sorry, that's not the page. This is the page. If I refresh, there it is. This is the response. This is the promise data that said was going to come back. Is this usable right now? No, this is exactly like what REST client gave me, a REST client response object. Naturally, I'm going to get some sort of response. So let's take a look. What did we do with that response object in Ruby? Let's take a quick look. We parsed it. I'm going to show you something. Promised data. Luckily for us, JavaScript also has some sort of parsed method, and it's called JSON. Cool? So what if I console logged this promised JSON data? Great, I get back another promise. But this time, this promise has an array in it. And it seems like my data is inside this array. So far, so good. I cannot do anything right now with this because it's inside a promise. So here's a weird thing. Remember how fetch returns, man, what does fetch return? A promise. And then on that promise, what did I do to it? What very specific, powerful method did I call on it? Then, right? So, this is the only time I will sanction this. Let's chain them. Let's run a then on this promise. Knowing now that I actually have the usable data in this promise. The first fetch returns just a promise object that says I will give you data. And then it comes back with this JSON data I can't use. So I have to parse the JSON. Then with the parsed data, I will then do something. Each then will receive the return value of the previous promise. So fetch returns a promise. The first then receives the data from this promise, whatever was returned. This fetch returns a promise, so this then receives what? The promise data, right? And there it is in this function, it receives it. All I did was I parsed it. So in order to get the next then, to have the return value of this then, what should I do in this function? So smart. So now, the then takes a what? Callback. Because I have to tell then what to do, right? And it receives the parsed JSON. I can name this anything. Again, these are just placeholders, right? So I'm just putting parsed JSON because of exactly what we just said. This then will receive the return of the previous then, which is parsed data, parsed JSON data, right? I mean, I could have called this hot dog if I wanted to, right? Doesn't matter. But this is just a little bit more explicit. Let's take a look at what that parsed JSON really is. So far, so good? So fetch returns a promise. This returns a promise now with parsed JSON data, and this will receive the return value of the previous promise, and I'm just going to log it. Awesome. And there it is. Are there any questions on that? Any questions on the thens, the chaining of the thens, what fetch returns, what a then returns? A promise. Yeah?
Oh, is this always how it's done? Like you always have to chain two thens to get the person?
No, you don't always have to chain two thens. But if your data comes back in an unusable format, you will have to parse it into a usable format and then do something with that usable format. There will be times where you don't need to parse it, which in that case you will then just use one then. Right? Very good question. However, for the most part, if you're playing with JSON, you will have to use two thens. Good question. Yeah.
Clarify on top of that, it's automatically passing in the previously returned value as the argument.
A then is a special method on a promise and will always receive the return value of the previous promise. You had a question? Yes.
So if this was this object, this promise object returning something a little more complex, that would a bigger object rather than just that
One array.
one array, would you have to like do some like key value kind of searching?
This is where I would put all that sexy logic about like how to do something with it. Because right now it's just an array, right? If I wanted to, would that work? Yeah, absolutely. I can do the logic here. Very good. Good analysis. Cool. So, knowing that, right, I'm going to parse this JSON. Can I force this to return something? Yeah, I can force it to return anything I want. Let's just use hot dog for fun. Right? Can I do another then? Yeah, right? I can if I wanted to. I can do a function, and then I can console log, right? So this is like value from last then, and then I can just log it, right? What will be the log here? Hot dog, right? Do I need to do this then? Do I need a third then? Or do I already have the data I need? We have the data we need, right? So, gone. I don't need this. I just want you to know a couple things about promises, and that is never break a promise chain. That will make sense later. And promises go on forever. Cool? That joke never lands. I thought it was hilarious when I first heard it. I told that to your class. Never lands. Yeah, I can then forever. But why would you need to once you have the data here?
That's really why it's called promise, because it promises.
That is the thought behind it, yes. Yeah. So now I need to explain async to you, and I'm going to try my best to do it. Because at this point, right, I don't have time to go into what we can do with the data, but at this point you have data, smiley face, right? That is actually what the parse JSON is, right? I can then probably, if I wanted to, right, create some HTML, and then I can probably use the data inside HTML, right? I can like probably, if I wanted to create like a p tag, right? Document.createElement, and then the inner text of this p tag could be parse JSON, and then I can, if I wanted to, append that data. Right? You know how to do this. So far, so good? Are there any questions on how to do this with this data?
Why can't you do all that before the second then? Just assign promise data.json to a variable and just use that instead of doing the .then.
Perfect. Good question. I was hoping for this. Why can't I do it here, right? Because this right here is a promise with the JSON parsed. I will then just need the actual data. I cannot create HTML with a promise object. So I have to work with the clean array object. Does that make sense?
Is it because that you only have access to it like with the .then because you're like waiting for it to happen in the beginning? It's
Yes.
just a promise.
I'm waiting for it to happen, right? Yeah.
What's the scope of the thens? Like if you wanted to run functions outside of the fetch with that data?
Yes. The question is, what is the scope of the thens, right? Then, right, is simply just like a regular method that you can see, is then being invoked, yes or no? Yes. Function, right, is a callback. So the scope of the thens works just like regular scope in JavaScript. This is a function. It has function scope, has access to the variables passed in. Any variables, right, defined in here, it has access to. And it has access to any global scope variables, anything on the outer chain. Good question. All right, so I'm not going to go over this because that's not important. That was yesterday's lesson, right? But now we have access to the data. I need to teach you what async is and what it means. And this is before the fetch. Oh, wow. Sorry. That wasn't even like a Freudian slip. I don't even know what that word was, right? And what would you describe this as? After the fetch, right? Let's make this, they have like a lot of interesting colors. You can put like brick red. It's pretty cool. All right, cool. So see how I've logged this here? And I have before the fetch and after the fetch. Based on what we currently know about JavaScript, what order do you think you will see the console logs? 31, then 38, and then 48, right? Who thinks that that's what's going to happen? Okay. Nobody? Very good. Smart class. If I refresh, oh God, I'm in JavaScript hell. Unexpected return token. What line was that? 35?
Turn the dot end.
Is there
No, this totally worked. Let me see.
curly brackets?
Oh, I deleted this. I deleted the open bracket. Man, that would have been rough. That would have been rough. Cool. Oh, it didn't like Friar Brick Red? Oh, dang it. Let's just put red. Embarrassing. Cool. Here's what happened. Before the fetch, after the fetch, and then this happened. Let me explain why this is. Okay? Before the fetch, this happened. After the fetch, this console logged, and then this console logged. Can you understand at least that order? Not why, but that order. Before this ran, and then this logged, then this logged. So far, so good on that order. Okay. What does fetch return? Promise, right? So this returned a promise, disappeared, and when the web request came back, it did these functions. You can imagine that it happened somewhere in the background. And while it's happening in the background, because it returned the promise, JavaScript was like, great, this returned a promise, it's happening in the background, cool beans, I'm gonna jump to line 48. This is how you create that good user experience. While that Twitter fetch is running and getting more tweets, JavaScript continues to run. All my click handlers still work, all my links still work, I can still scroll. And then when it comes back, it will add on so that it doesn't block my code. It doesn't stop the user experience from running. Did that make sense? As opposed to earlier when I ran that sleep function, you notice I clicked a bunch of times and then all those clicks fired after the sleep. The sleep was considered blocking. So far, so good?
So if you put a sleep right before the fetch, would it pass the sleep on the fetch and come back? Or
If I put the sleep here, it will literally sleep, then run the fetch, return the promise immediately, and then console log. Great. Let me explain async. I have to draw this out because it's pretty good. So, start drawing. Apologize, I'm not an artist, but Alex is. I just learned that. You guys had Alex? Alex Griffith? Yeah, he has like an art degree. Wow, that's amazing. And now he's a developer. Life is interesting. All right, cool. So, we talked about how JavaScript works, right? I'm gonna draw something for you. This is terrible. Think of it as like a stack, right? So you have like a stack of pancakes here, right? Pancake 1, pancake 2, pancake 3, and then some jelly and some syrup, right? Can you eat this bottom pancake without removing the top two? I mean, if you're a savage somehow, but the idea is that like coming from the top, you can't, right? So the concept here with this is FILO. First in, last out. Right? This pancake went in first, number 1, but I cannot eat it until pancakes 3 and 2 are eaten, and then pancake 1 can be consumed. Cool? So this right here is a different type of data structure, something you haven't really seen before, called a stack. So you've seen arrays, you've seen hashes, you've seen strings, right? Those are all sort of like data structures. This new one is called a stack. So the way JavaScript works, and you've probably heard this before, like, oh, you're gonna put it on the call stack, something like that. If you haven't, JavaScript works in a stack. Right? All of the way the JavaScript executes is in a stack. Who watched that 3-hour video, which we told you to watch at 2.5 speed, and also skipped that first hour? Okay. Before you do anything else, after this lecture, watch that video. I'm serious. It is important that you stop doing labs and watch that video. There's another video I'm going to put out. It's called the event loop. Good. Whatever you do, right? Get a coffee, get some tea, get some bubble tea, get some food. Stop doing labs and watch that video. Is everyone clear? Watch the understanding the weird parts of JavaScript first, which is like the 3-hour video, which you cut down to 2, but if you watch it at 2 times speed, you cut it down to 1, right? And then watch the event loop video. Preferably more than once, until you understand it. I'm gonna try my best to explain that whole video in 4 minutes. Cool, ready? Let's go. Great. 2 times speed, here we go. Man, I'm gonna sound like a chipmunk on the recording, right? So the first thing that happens, right, we talked about how JavaScript executes your code, is it will execute top to bottom, left to right. The first thing it will see in my code, as an example, is I'm gonna assign this variable, I'm gonna have this event listener, cool, and I'm gonna have this console log, right? This console log, function or not a function? Function, right? So console log, right, comes on. And then it actually executes this right here. Think of this as like sort of the return value for this console log. Once it returns or it completes, right, it runs to the last line, what does it do? Pops off the stack. It comes off the call stack. Cool? The next thing that happens is I have another console log. That goes on the stack, finishes executing, and then pops off the stack. You can imagine now if I had, let's just do this, right, for funsies. I have function 1, boop, boop, and all that does is it executes a function called 2. Function 2, boop, boop. And all this does is it logs, ha, I'm 2, the best, right? Because first is the worst, right? So function 1 will call function 2. Are there any questions on this? Right? When does function 1 get executed? That's right, never. So we must invoke function 1. Right? So far, so good. So function 1 will execute and invoke function 2. So far, so good? Great. Function 1 will get put on the call stack. 1. And then what does function 1 do? It invokes function 2. So guess what gets put on the call stack? 2. All right? If this did anything else, like, I don't know, log, it gets put on the call stack. Log completes, pops off the call stack. Is there anything else to do inside function 2? No. Function 2 is complete, pops off the call stack. Is there anything else to do inside 1? No. Pops off the call stack. And now it's clear. Now it will run the next line of code. So JavaScript works in this stack-like manner. So far, so good. The problem is we get into blocking code, right? Notice how nothing continued until function 1 was done. But function 1 calls function 2. And then function 2 logs. Nothing else happens until the log is done, function 2 is done, function 1 is done, and then it continues running, eventually getting to the fetch. So far, so good. Great. This fetch, we've determined that it takes a quasi amount of time, right? Undefined amount of time, this fetch function. I cannot do anything else until this fetch is off the call stack. Can I remove the fetch from the call stack somehow? What would you envision a way to remove fetch off the call stack? Wouldn't it be nice, instead of this fetch going and getting some data, I'm gonna do a mod 2 lecture, going getting some data from a server, right? Like ronswansonquotes.com, whatever. And then coming back with some data, and then popping off the call stack. That's what you think is happening. However, the fetch comes on the call stack. So far, so good, right? What does it return? It returns a promise. So it returns a promise immediately, which means that pops off the call stack. And then the next log runs. That's what's happening. Do you understand? So the first log will come in, right? Execute. The fetch will come on, immediately return a promise, pop off the call stack, and then your code continues running. What happens when it pops off the call stack? It goes into something called the event loop, right? And this is handled by the browser. Google Chrome will handle your web request so that JavaScript can continue executing while your fetch actually retrieves data from the server. Once it actually gets the data back, it pops into another sort of line. And this is called the queue. Right? It's very English. It just means like a line. Right? So now you've got data. Your fetch returned a promise, popped off the call stack so that it was not blocking, goes into this event loop, actually makes the request. When the request comes back with data, it pops on the queue. When does the queue push back onto the call stack? Well, I will tell you this. The queue is very, very polite. And it will wait. It will wait until the entire code executes, until it is done. And then it will, after the call stack is clear, nothing else in your JavaScript runs. When this is clear, it'll go, hey, you done? Great. The data will come back. This is when your .then function will execute. Then it will execute. So, quick rundown. Log. On, off the call stack. This is just definitions. 1 on the call stack. 1 calls 2. 2 is on the call stack. Logs. Log pops off. 2 pops off. 1 pops off, runs the fetch. Fetch goes on, returns a promise, pops off immediately. Doesn't do anything, literally returns a promise. Log. I scroll all the way down. I have some commented code here, whatever. 173 is the last line of my code. My call stack is complete. What happens now? Then the callback gets called. Then this callback gets called. Then you see the log. So, if you were paying attention, this logs first. Promise returns, pops off the call stack. This logs second. Then you see this log. And that is why, oops, just kidding. Oh, just kidding. Nope, don't want to do that. Nope, that's your old lecture. You see before, I'm 2, I'm the best. Then after the fetch, then the fetch call, right? So let's walk that. Before the fetch, I'm the best. Pops off the call stack, hangs out in the event loop somewhere. You see this. Then it runs, boop, 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 boop. It finishes. Then these get called in that order. That's why the logs come in this order. Are there any questions on the call stack, asynchronous, how it becomes non-blocking, and why it's in the order it's in? No, you do not control the order of the queue. That is handled by the browser. There's ways to manipulate it. It becomes very complicated. That's a different lecture entirely. Yes. I don't mean to be short. I'm just trying to give you the answer because that's mod 2 waiting. I'm literally going to jump right into a lecture. Rails. All right, great. Thanks. Thank you. That's all I got for you.